Good afternoon. I acknowledge that we're gathered here today on the traditional territory of Treaty 6, and I also want to acknowledge the Métis people who share a deep connection to this land. Joining me virtually today is Tracy Manuel, a new mom in Fort McMurray, and Matt Beauchamp, a working dad in Calgary. Thank you for joining us, Tracy and Matt, and Tracy's little one too, of course. As we will hear in a moment, many parents like Tracy and Matt are facing a challenge in this province, accessing childcare. The pandemic caused many issues for early learning and childcare programs. They quickly had to pivot to ensure spaces were safe for families and accessible to everyone who needed them. That quick pivot to keep kids safe and deal with the global pandemic is no small feat. But Alberta childcare operators also had to do so with little support from the UCP government. Childcare programs saw a dramatic increase in attendance, or decrease, in attendance, while Alberta families worked from home and operators had to account for capacity reduction to ensure safe physical distancing. During the last 2 years, the childcare sector has seen 20% of its workforce leave the field. Now, as Albertans look to return back to work and childcare centres can open up spaces to accept more children, they're unable to find early learning and childcare educators to staff their spaces. So they're left turning parents like Tracy and Matt away. I'd now like to turn the mic over to Tracy to share her story.
Hello, thank you for having me today. My name is Tracy Manuel and I'm a new mom in Fort McMurray. I'm looking forward to heading back to work around May or June since I've been on mat leave after having my first baby last year. Obviously, returning to work comes with mixed feelings. On one hand, I'm excited to go back to my job, and on the other, I'm sad to not spend full days with our son. But on top of that, I am concerned about finding a quality childcare space for him, which is an added stress that I didn't anticipate when becoming a mom. Early into my pregnancy, I knew that I wanted to have my child attend the nest for childcare, and so I put myself on the wait list as soon as I could. Personally, I really like the nest. I trust them. They do a great job planning educational and outdoor activities with their kids, and they came highly recommended to me multiple times. We wanted a good day home for our son, and we knew that this was the place. But now I'm not sure that we will be able to get in, which is leaving us in a bit of a scramble to find a backup plan. I do know the nest has been trying to find educators for months, and they haven't been able to. Their wait list is growing and they keep having to turn parents away as a result. The nest isn't the only daycare center that has to turn us away either. I know there's lots of centers in town having a hard time finding staff. For me, not returning to work isn't an option because I do love working and it is expensive to live here. So with that, my hope is that there is a solution to help centers like the Nest in finding staff so families don't have to go through the additional stress of getting quality daycare. Thank you for letting me share my story.
Thank you so much, Tracy. And I know there are so many families, particularly in Fort McMurray, that are experiencing the same troubles you are. Now I'd like to invite Matt, who's in Calgary, to share his story.
Hi, thanks for allowing me to speak today. My name is Matt Beauchamp, and I'm a working dad in Calgary. We have spent the last couple of months looking for childcare for my 5-year-old daughter and my 2-year-old son through a licensed provider, as our current method of childcare doesn't fall under the new federal government plan and has started to become unaffordable for us. What we didn't expect was to have such a hard time finding a space for our kids. We have searched all over South Calgary and met with waiting lists ranging from 25 people to 50 families. Even when touring one last week, there was a large number of parents on the tour with us, as well as a huge number of parents waiting to book tours. So undoubtedly that facility is going to be full as soon as it opens. We've noticed that centers are also raising their rates as demand continues to climb, which is adding to the stress and the cost, obviously. It feels daunting. We're starting to get worried that we might not be able to find space for our kids. Some childcare centers have told us that if we can hold out until the summer, some families might move on or children might age out, and then there could be space for us, but that could be 5, 6, 7 months away. We're fortunate in the sense that we have a current arrangement for childcare, but after too long, it won't be affordable. And I honestly can't imagine how some families in our area are handling this or feeling without any options in front of them. There should be options. We have a historical deal with the federal government to make childcare accessible for everyone, yet so many families in Alberta are struggling to find spaces, and it really shouldn't be this way. Thank you for letting me share my story today.
And thank you, Matt, for sharing your story. We appreciate it. As you mentioned, there's so many families who are experiencing the same thing. And really, the stress of finding a childcare space is something that no parent should have to deal with. The ability to attract staff with competitive wages and arrange fee structures to work within the federal government's childcare investment is something that the sector has been strongly advocating the UCP to do something about for some time now. I was in Fort McMurray myself 2 weeks ago, and I heard stories about early childhood educators who are working 2 jobs to make ends meet, or they're leaving childcare work altogether to work at retail jobs where they will earn more. The UCP has claimed that they will create 10,000 more nonprofit childcare spaces this year, but who will staff those spaces? It begins with offering educators who are doing the important professional work of early childhood education a decent wage. And right now, Alberta educators receive on average the 3rd lowest pay in the country. These concerns are going ignored by the UCP, and it's leaving many parents without a childcare space for their family. In the UCP budget released last week, we didn't see a single additional cent invested by the province to reinforce the funding from the federal government to ensure affordable and accessible childcare for all Alberta families. Not one penny. Let me remind you, the investment from the federal government was designed to be a collaboration with the provinces to ensure all families will have access to $10 per day childcare by the end of 2026 and cut fees by the end of this year. Alberta was also one of the last provinces to reach an agreement with the federal government. The UCP's delay left $268 million on the table in Ottawa last year, which childcare operators could have used to accelerate recruitment and training of workers to support the growth of childcare spaces that parents like Tracy and Matt desperately need right now. In fact, we saw Manitoba take this approach, and operators there will be seeing the benefits by the end of March, just a few weeks from now. It includes top-ups for pension and RRSPs for early childhood educators. It includes reimbursing tuition costs up to $4,000 per year, where in Alberta we only offer $1,500 per year. And wage top-ups until the childcare and early learning educator wage grid is established. Every year that $10 per day childcare is delayed will cost parents in this province an additional $4,800 per year, and it takes $725 million out of the pockets of Alberta families. If the UCP doesn't invest any additional provincial dollars into childcare, there is no way that all Alberta families will benefit from $10 per day childcare by 2026, and the UCP knows this. If the UCP had chosen to match the NDP commitment of increasing provincial investment by 50% in 2022-23 to ensure the stability and longevity of the $10 per day childcare deal, the UCP could still have their balanced budget with a $360 million surplus. But instead, we continue to be behind other provinces and are behind in staffing up the sector to ensure parents like Tracy and Matt have space for their child to be taken care of. Alberta's government must invest in childcare to ensure the longevity and accessibility of the childcare program. And should the NDP have the privilege of forming government, we have pledged to ensure parents have access to $10 per day childcare 2 years sooner. This will keep childcare as a priority for Alberta's economy and our families. Thank you, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
All right, thank you, Rakhi. We'll now go to questions. Just a reminder for those joining us on the phones to use the *9 function, and for those joining us on Zoom to use the raise hand function to get into the question queue. We'll go to our first caller, Lisa Johnson from the Edmonton Journal. Go ahead.
Hi, Rakhi. Thanks for taking my question today. I'm wondering if we could go back in time just a little bit to when the federal deal was announced. I know that there was some criticism from childcare operators and different communities about some of its inadequacies as it was being applied in Alberta. Can you go back to that and summarize what you've heard from people in terms of how that program was laid out and what it succeeded in doing or what it failed in doing?
Well, thank you, Lisa, for the question. So when the other provinces were signing their agreements with the federal governments last year, every province, of course, their deal was a little bit different. And what we know, though, is that the funding from that federal agreement was meant to go towards children between the ages of 0 up until preschool age in licensed childcare settings, and there had to be a focus on increasing childcare spaces in not-for-profit settings. And for reasons that we all can speculate about, and we all certainly did, for the political reasons that the UCP delayed in terms of signing that agreement over 4 months, as we're seeing today, that actually cost Alberta families significant amount of money. It delayed $268 million from being invested into our economy, and that the work could have been done at that point to really do the workforce retention and attraction that we're saying is desperately needed right now to make sure that more families have access to affordable childcare. So since that agreement was signed by the UCP government in November 15th, I think many families are happy to see that that right now many of their fees are going down. Now, we know that the reduction in fees is inequitable. We know that lowest income families are not seeing the reduction that was promised. In fact, I just got off the phone with somebody this morning who was telling me that their lowest income parents were actually paying more for childcare under this new deal than they were before. So that's problematic in terms of how it's rolled out. But there's some glaring absences from the UCP implementation of this agreement. And the first is that they have completely ignored an investment into the workforce. I was expecting, and many operators and advocates in the early childhood sector were expecting to see that there would be some recognition of the wage gap that exists right now for educators, and that there would be an investment in terms of their increase in wages as well as setting a wage grid. And many were quite shocked to see that that was not part of the initial implementation, because what that means is exactly what we're hearing families like Tracy and Matt experience right now. We've lost so many early childhood educators from the sector. It's simply not worth their while to be able to stay in this work. They have their own families to care for and their own families to put a roof over their heads and food on the table. And as we know, all of those things have become a lot more expensive for Alberta families. So they're struggling to make ends meet, and they're simply not getting paid enough in early childhood education to stay in the workforce. So that to address that problem, we needed to see some wage grid implementation as well as wage increases so that we can at least keep the workforce that we have, attract more, so that more spaces can be open, so families like Tracy and Matt's don't have to wait on long wait lists, don't have to wait to see whether or not they can get a space, don't have to leave their jobs or find other unlicensed care to manage what's going on. We need that right now so that families can go back to work and to participate. Life is only getting more expensive under this government, and they're not taking any measures to make it more affordable for them. We need to make sure that our educators are paid a decent wage so that we can address that shortcoming.
Do you have a follow-up, Lisa?
Yes, Rakhi, you mentioned that the province needs to invest in order to be able to get to the $10 a day by 2026. How much exactly does the province need to put into this right now? And I know you mentioned wage top-ups. There was $300 million earmarked for professional development and training, but nothing specifically for wage top-ups. Do you have a specific dollar figure that you're calling for today?
Absolutely. When we rolled out our proposal for the federal funding last year, we indicated that in order to reach $10 per day by 2026, the province has to put an additional 50% of its provincial childcare budget into budget 2022. So that would mean an additional $200 million. This is why we're saying $200 million additional provincial investment this year would still mean that this government has that $360 million surplus that they're talking about. So that's still on the table, but we know that there's absolutely no way to get to $10 per day childcare by 2026 unless there is an increase in provincial spending. There just isn't, because this is always going to be a collaboration between the federal government and the provinces. Right now, we see that the UCP is quite content to have the federal government primarily fund childcare in this province. We need to see this UCP make the investment that's required, $200 million in budget 2022, in order to get us along the path to making sure that all families have access to $10 per day childcare.
Anything additional, Lisa, before we go to our next caller?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, but isn't that on the feds? I mean, if this was a federal program, the province of Alberta never promised any additional funding through this program. Isn't it on the feds if this plan fails to achieve the goals that it set out to achieve?
Absolutely not. I would say this is actually a provincial responsibility is early learning and childcare for Alberta families. The federal funding is an incredible investment, but it does not take away the responsibility of the province to deliver early childhood education to Alberta families. I would put the question to the UCP to demonstrate how they plan on getting to $10 per day childcare for all families without additional provincial investment. Now, one thing I'll mention is, unlike many other provinces, this provincial government has still not even made public the agreement that it reached with the federal government. They haven't published that. They haven't released their action plan. So we don't know exactly what they agreed to in that agreement, but the entire terms of this funding from the federal government was around achieving $10 per day childcare by 2025-26. And there is simply no way on the books that they can reach that objective without some additional provincial funding. And let's be clear, in other provinces, the expectation under this funding agreement was that by the end of 2025-26, that the federal government and the provinces would be working in collaboration to each equally contribute to the cost of funding childcare. So again, we have to see an increase in commitment from the UCP government in order to achieve $10 per day childcare, and the lack of provincial investment speaks to me that perhaps this government isn't committed to achieving $10 per day childcare.
All right, we'll go to our next caller, Janet French from the CBC. Your line is open.
Hello. I guess just to follow up on that, I mean, politically, what does the provincial government care whether or not they meet the $10 a day goal? It was never their promise. It was a promise of the Liberal government, the federal Liberal government, who they're at odds with. What do they have to gain from trying to reach this goal?
Well, I would hope that any provincial government would take to heart the interests of the citizens it serves. And Alberta families have been pretty clear in terms of what they need in terms of support from this government in order to have affordable childcare. You know, the very fact that this UCP government actually signed this deal with the federal government was done against their will. That was pretty clear from the beginning, that the UCP had no commitment to the principles of affordable, accessible, quality childcare. It's pretty clear they didn't think it was a priority for them. The only reason that they reluctantly, and let's be clear, very reluctantly, signed this deal with the federal government was because Albertans spoke up over and over and over again and called on this government to access that funding on the table from the federal government in order to make childcare more affordable and accessible for their families. And that's important more than ever now, not just for those particular families who are facing rising costs and everything from utility costs and insurance fees and school fees, and everything is going up for families. But we also know that it's critically important to our economic recovery. So, I mean, at the end of the day, the UCP government very reluctantly signed this agreement because that's what Albertans wanted them to do. So this government doesn't have a strong track record of listening to Albertans and doing things in their best interests. They seem to only care about their own political interests. But on $10 a day childcare, that's what Alberta families want, and so this government should deliver.
Do you have a follow-up, Janet?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about, back to Matt and Tracy's problem, like creating more childcare spaces. Some of that you can't create 10,000 spaces within the daycare centers that exist today. So, but isn't that on the private sector and the nonprofit sector to try and create those centers? I'm trying to understand why that's the province's fault. So what lack of action are you saying that they've, how are they being neglectful and not trying to make it more attractive to open a childcare center, a licensed childcare center right now?
What we want to see from the provincial government is that they've signed an agreement to commit to create 10,000 new non-for-profit spaces in this year alone. There has to be some investment to do that. So that is going to require working with partners in the non-profit sector and existing private centers to expand spaces. That could be infrastructure spending in terms of actually renovating spaces or building new spaces and providing support to do that. But as we've said, spaces alone are not the answer, even if they're physically there, if there are no staff to work them. We have a significant labor shortage problem in this province, and we can't simply just say that those parents who are already in the system should benefit from affordable childcare. The goal of this program is also to ensure that more families have access to it. In order for more families to have access to affordable childcare, they need to be able to go to spaces that are staffed, and we have a staffing problem in this province. And that's what I'm hearing from providers from Fort McMurray to Calgary to Edmonton to Grand Prairie to Jasper, the staffing issue is consistent. They're saying they're putting up postings and they can't find staff. That is something that the government should be taking action on. That's why creating incentives to return to the early childhood education workforce, creating incentives to keep them in that workforce, professional development opportunities, a wage growth, a decent wage for professional work is critical to make sure that we have those people come back to the workforce so more families can access childcare.
Anything further, Janet?
No, I'm fine, thank you.
All right, and we'll do one last pass for questions. Just a reminder for those on the phone to use *9 and for those on Zoom to use the raise hand function to get into the question queue. And with no further questions today, we'll wrap. Thanks, folks.
Thank you, Matt. And thank you, Tracy.
Thank you, everyone.
Tracy, what's your little one's name?
He's Tommy.
Hi, Tommy. Oh, how old is
Tens of thousands of Albertans have already provided their idea for how we can build Alberta's future. You can too by going to albertasfuture.ca.